The Israel-Hamas ceasefire, as you know by now, is back on, following some shaky ground and some retaliatory strikes by Israel on dozens of Hamas terror targets throughout the Gaza Strip. In a statement this morning, Israel Defense Forces said it will continue to uphold the ceasefire agreement and will respond firmly to any violation of it. So, the latest flare-up has not derailed the peace process, but just how close to the edge of the cliff are we? Well, joining me now to discuss this and more is Dr. David Adesnik. He's Vice President of Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He also previously served as Deputy Director for the Joint Data Support at the U.S. Department of Defense. David, thank you so much for joining us on Washington Watch. We appreciate you coming.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, it has been quite an eventful 24 hours that's unfolded between Israel and Hamas. Tell us what this ceasefire is holding on by and the direction that things have been headed, and give us your thoughts on it.
Well, we've seen a pattern a few times now where there seems to be probes by Hamas to see if a violation will provoke an Israeli reaction. Not uncommonly, it could happen at night. It could happen in a place where there's not a lot of surveillance, and we wind up with questions about who moved first. But that's all part of what Hamas wants. They ideally would like to establish a situation where they violate the ceasefire, and then all the pressure is on Israel not to fire back. I mean, clearly so far, Israel's not feeling that pressure. They've hit back quite hard, because what they're concerned about is a situation where Hamas establishes for itself a right to shoot, to snipe at Israeli targets, and then be free from retaliation despite what it does. So I don't think that tells us we're very near a cliff. Rather, we're in a testing phase where Hamas wants to see how much the United States is committed to preserving this and how much freedom of action it will give to Israel.
Okay, well, that's a good take, and I think that's consistent with what I'm hearing, frankly, from the Trump administration, where the president has been expressing confidence that the ceasefire is going to hold. So am I hearing you correctly that you would agree with that at least for now, you see this holding?
I always hesitate to wager too much on predictions about what's going to happen in the Middle East, but my sense is the one you described, that I think it's more likely than not it's going to hold. We may see more rounds of violations and firing back, but it's a feeling out process right now. I don't think either side wants to go back to war. I mean, there's no question Israelis have been fighting 2 years after the trauma of October 7th. They would much rather take a break, prepare, and heal. And Hamas seems to have been hurt pretty badly. It's always hard to tell with them, but I'm not sure they want another full round of fighting either.
So just going a little bit deeper into this, let me ask you this question, because Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene drew some attention today by citing some casualty figures that came from the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, which claimed that there were, I think, 46 children who were killed in the strikes. My question to you is, are those figures that come out of the so-called local health officials there, are those independently verified, or do they differentiate between civilians and combatants and that type of thing? Is that accurate? Are those numbers accurate, do you believe?
So I've done a fair amount of research on this over the course of the war, and a lot of caution is in order. First, you flagged the point that there's never any information included about how many of those who were hit were Hamas fighters. The idea is to present the largest possible death toll and give people outside no information about how many were, people potentially even firing at the Israelis or military targets. As for the ministry itself, it's unfortunate when the news, I just saw NBC News do it, refers to it as just local health officials. This is part of a Hamas-run dictatorship in Gaza. It's under political control, even if there are some people who just want to do their job, as there are in any dictatorship. The bottom line comes from the top. That said, there has been a lot of suffering by civilians in this situation. Hamas has provoked a war in a fairly small sandbox, and the people are not allowed to leave. In most wars, like in the war in Syria, across Israel's northern border, millions of people flee to get away from a war zone. Hamas doesn't want that. Other people don't want that. So unfortunately, we have seen a lot of civilian casualties. Roughly, if we're talking about several tens of thousands of people that have been killed, and many of them fighters, I think that number is probably in the ballpark. On any given day, it's basically impossible to verify the number that comes out of the health ministry, whether they say 20, 40, 100. There's no verification by anyone who isn't Hamas.
Okay, so let's turn a little bit of our discussion to the remaining deceased hostages. What is the latest on that? That seems to be yet another piece of this that's just all over the map from one day to the next.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a commitment by Hamas as part of the ceasefire they agreed to return all of the remains. When we say all the hostages, it's the 20 living that were returned right away, and there's a number of those whose remains have not yet come back. It's very hard to tell. Did Hamas genuinely lose control of those remains? Does it not know where they are? There seems to be a number of cases. Well, there's definitely cases where they have returned remains that Israeli authorities examined and found did not belong to Israeli hostages. It's not entirely clear if this is a deliberate deception or more of a matter of incompetence or testing boundaries. There even has been reported footage of a case where remains were buried deliberately and then uncovered, sort of in a show for the Israelis. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and I would hesitate to say anything firm about exactly what Hamas has in plan.
Yeah, there really is a lot of uncertainty, and yet I know this is, and you know, this is a big issue to Israel. So it's going to be interesting again to see how that goes. Let me go now to President Trump's 20-point peace plan. Part of that involves disarming Hamas. Okay, we've had Qatar's prime minister was asked about this yesterday, and he said that they are pushing Hamas and all Palestinian factions in Gaza to get to the point where they acknowledge that they need to disarm. So what does that tell you about where we are on this part of the peace plan?
Well, it says, I don't think we've made much progress beyond the initial agreement where Hamas said it would return the hostages and basically said they are signing up for none of the other effectively 19 points in that plan. They've been ambiguous, they've been evasive, at times off the record they've just said, we're not disarming. There's no sense they really want to do that. I think fundamentally they want to test who's going to disarm us. You know, the United States is insisting this is part of the plan. I don't think Egyptian or Jordanian or Saudi or Emirati troops want to go in and do it. For Israeli troops to go in is to renew the war, and I think they're betting the Israelis don't want to do that, and certainly we know there's not going to be American boots on the ground. I think Hamas is making a fairly astute gamble that no one is really going to force this on them.
You see, and that to me, at least, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that to me brings us full circle back around that this thing is hanging by a thread, this whole peace deal. I mean, if they are not going to be disarmed, they will use their arms, and this peace does not take effect.
It's true, but I think the question is how long might a truce hold, just because both sides are rearming and preparing for the next round rather than getting ready to continue immediately. So, you know, compared to other offers that have been put on the table previously, one of the things about the Trump plan is Israel did not have to pull entirely out of Gaza in order to get its hostages back. There's a so-called yellow line roughly cutting Gaza in half. And, you know, while on one side of the line, basically to the west, Hamas has control, Israel has positions from which it can hit back as well. So it didn't have to give up everything it fought for during the war. So I do think it's possible. And this is why we saw a year or 2 years between the numerous rounds of fighting previously, right? We first had one in 2008, 2009, 2011, 2014, 2021. Why do they stop any time if they still have weapons? Because like in any war, people want to rest, rearm, and get ready for the next round. I think Israel would prefer no more rounds. It would like a solid agreement to get everyone back, all hostages, all remains, and have a government there that was more interested in building up the place than having it destroyed again in an effort to destroy Israel. But they also know they're not going to get that likely, and Hamas is just preparing because its mission remains the same from the moment it emerged in 1988 with its charter. It's to destroy the Zionist entity.
Right. Getting less attention in all of this is the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. How's that going?
Well, the pause in fighting has made that a lot easier. I mean, it was a very controversial situation, and some of the international authorities declared, in fact, there was quote a famine in Gaza. This is something I've been tracking fairly closely. I think the claims were made based on these authorities bending the statistics quite a bit. They have a whole, 200-page guidebook on the technical specifications, but where were the people actually starving to death? They sort of made a finding. Well, we're just pretty sure it's happening, even if we can't see it. So the aid was coming in more than many of the headlines would have led you to believe. And one of the biggest problems, which was the constant looting, is abating now. I mean, we have this crazy situation where basically 5 out of every 6 trucks that UN agencies were sending into Gaza, they knew they weren't going to reach their destination, that either gangs or just hungry people, or possibly the two in coordination, were going to strip those trucks of what they had.
The president did not originally set a timeline for this 20-point peace plan. But from what you're seeing, do you have any idea when it might unfold? Are we talking weeks or months or maybe even years?
Well, there is an effort underway that the Egyptians initiated to form a so-called administrative committee that would be something like the technocratic, non-political committee that the plan calls for to govern Gaza in the interim. The problem is the Egyptians included Hamas in the negotiations and let them pick people on the committee. It'll be interesting now to see how the U.S. responds. If it just swats that down and says, look, no dice, you included Hamas, and the condition of our plan is that there's no Hamas in the future of running Gaza. It could happen relatively quickly if all of the parties agree to it. And I think especially interesting is the role that Qatar, whom you mentioned before, in a way they've been Hamas's lawyer all along. The Turks have played a similar role. The ceasefire and the exchange of hostages seemed to happen when the countries in the region that were Hamas's biggest advocates finally seemed to put pressure on it, instead of just working to extract more concessions from the Israelis and the United States. If for some reason they really did that behind the scenes and stopped just if they said, we're not going to give you sanctuary anymore in Istanbul or in Doha unless you follow through with Trump's plan, then we might see it happen. If their goal is to just prolong things and get back to a place where Hamas has freedom of action, we'd likely see that.
We've only got a few minutes left here, but there's one more thing that I wanted to get your take on. We actually highlighted on this program yesterday, but Tucker Carlson has been getting some criticism for remarks he made Monday regarding Christian support for Israel. I'd like to play a clip and then get your response, if I could. Play clip 1 for me, please.
How do you explain Mike Huckabee, Ted Cruz, and there are a lot like that, John Bolton? I mean, I've known them all, George W. Bush, like Karl Rove. I mean, all people I know personally who I've seen be seized by this brain virus, and they're not Jewish. Most of them are self-described Christians, and then the Christian Zionists who are, well, Christian Zionists. Like, what is that?
Right.
And I can just say for myself, I dislike them more than anybody, because what? Because it's Christian heresy, and I'm offended by that as a Christian.
Your response to that?
Well, first I would note who Mr. Carlson is talking to there. It's a known Holocaust denier and racist, Nick Fuentes, someone who insulted the vice president's wife for not being white, and the vice president Vance shot right back that he sees no place for someone like that at his side. As for Mr. Carlson, what a way to lower the level of debate, saying that people who have a different opinion have a brain virus. It's not hard if you try just a little to see why a well-informed Christian might be a Zionist. I can't speak for Christians. I'm not one. I happen to be Jewish. But if you are someone, whether it's on the basis of Genesis 12:3 or something else, have a concern about the fate of the Jewish people, you say this was a people oppressed for centuries, struggling to find a place, then like many of the Christian Zionists who helped, found the state of Israel by arranging the Balfour Declaration and other things, you might say this people needs a state to protect it. It's not a brain virus. It's a real humanitarian concern, and it's entirely regrettable that, you see more conspiracy theories and insults rather than serious thinking.
Yeah, it's not a brain virus. It's not a theological virus either. I mean, there's a major issue of biblical interpretation that God made a covenant with the Jewish nation, and that covenant has not gone away. It's an everlasting covenant, as the Scripture describes. So I wanted to get your take on that, because this certainly has created quite an uproar, as well it should have, on so many fronts. Dr. David Adesnik, Vice President of Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you so much for joining us today on Washington Watch. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.